Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the seminar regarding mapping industrial data for future risk. My name's Julian Haslam-Jones. I am a director at HKA, and I've had a wealth of experience dealing with claims in the oil and gas industry, both here in the Middle East, but also across the region. And what I want to discuss with you today is really how we can use the data that we've pulled together from these claims and disputes and manage future risks on the projects. What I'd like to say just before we get going, and we've got about a 20-minute session here, so I'm going to reasonably quickly move through the slides, is if you can raise questions as I'm going, I would really welcome that. And if I will try and answer all questions, but if I don't, please visit our booth today and we'll answer any questions that I don't manage to get to today. So without further ado, I'll start the seminar. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is our database that we've built. I'm not going to go into too much about this because I really want to show you how you can use it and how the data can help you. It's called Crux, and basically, make it as simplistically as possible. What we've done is looked at all the causations on the claims and disputes that have arisen through our commissions and put this into a database. So it gives you an idea of the type of disputes and claims that you might see on certain projects around the world in certain industries. And it, as I said, it really is focusing on the causes of claims on the construction and engineering projects. In the latest report, we do annual reports, so we do one every year. We've looked at over 1,100 plus projects across 88 countries. As I said, it's not just oil and gas, it's in all the sectors that you would see. So you can break the data down into industry, oil and gas, buildings, infrastructure, etc. It's a global collection, so it covers not just the Middle East, but the rest of the world as well. There's lots of different contract types in the data as well. So there, I put up here a couple of typical ones like FIDIC, NEC, JCT, but there's lots of other standard forms of contract that we've got that are part of the data. And the procurement route varies as well. So it's not just lump sum jobs, it might be design and build, construction only, these kind of things. From a regional analysis, we've looked right across the globe. I've put up here the countries that are covered. We've got the Americas, Asian Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. And I think, I put a quote up here, but the main thing I want to get across to you guys today, and where I think this data is really useful, is you can look at this data and say, okay, for example, in the Middle East on a lump sum job on for oil and gas or offshore, these are the types of causations of disputes. And when you're looking at either procuring your project or executing your project, you can be aware of that these are the kind of issues that can come up. And that will help you to avoid delay, disruption, cost escalation. That's the best way to use this data, and really the main message I want to get across to you today. Moving on, what we found, and this is more on a global basis, but what we found across the globe is the root causes. The main one that we see is change in scope. So this is either the owner coming and making a variation to the work, or some circumstances that are actually changing the execution of the work. But this seems to be the main cause of disputes. But there's some other ones up here as well: incorrect or incomplete designs, poor management of third parties, inadequate contract management, deficiencies in workmanship. So even if you were to take this as an example on a global basis, this data already gives you 5 main things here that when you're looking at procuring your project, and then executing your project. These are the kind of things you need to be aware of. So for example, you need to be careful that there is limited changes to the work. How can you do that? We'll make sure that the design is finalized before the construction starts. Make sure that if there is an issue that comes up regarding changing the works, do you really need it? These kind of things. Incomplete or incorrect designs. Again, when you're procuring your design, you need to really make sure that you've allocated the right party to do that. And again, making sure that they're capable of producing a solid design that isn't going to have issues later. Third parties, that's always an issue in the contracts. Again, in my experience, when you're looking at this, you need to make sure that, and what I would recommend is that you allocate the best placed party to manage this risk. Inadequate contract management, that, for example, is when the terms of the contract are not used correctly. So again, this is one way of avoiding this, and what I found is really useful is wargaming with the project team at the start of the project, making sure that they're aware of all the terms and conditions and understand how the mechanisms work. That's one way to avoid that. And deficiencies in workmanship, again, this would be making sure you have the right skill sets, and also that those skill sets are available in that part of the world where you might be constructing the works. What you can do, I put up another quote here from the Bartlett School of Construction and Project Management. Again, this is touching on the same theme that I've spoken to you about at the start, which is really focusing on, how the information can help you make better choices and decisions and prevent or reduce possible claims and disputes. From my experience, what I see time and time again from people engaging myself is they end up in a situation where there's a claim on a project. They engage us to come in and resolve that issue, either reviewing the claim if we're on the operator's side of the table, or or building the claim for the contractor. And then the issue is resolved and moved on, but that organization doesn't try to understand, okay, this is the reason why these issues came up, and take those lessons learned and put them into their organization. So look at, for example, how their procedures can be changed, how the teams can be trained differently to avoid this issue, how data can be collected so that the records are accurate, and all these kind of things. So what you can actually do with the data, and I guess this is what I'm going to talk to you about next, I think is probably the more interesting part of the presentation, is you have all this data, but we can actually break it down into different sectors. So for example, I've put up on the screen here the oil and gas Middle East breakdown. Okay, so we've got 48 projects across 4 countries, capex value of over 116 billion, and a total of 250 underlying causes and 156 primary, 94 secondary. So if, for example, you are an organization that is maybe coming to the Middle East market, and maybe you're not going to a specific country, maybe you're going across the region, based on the data that we've got, the typical issues that you're going to come up, again, we've got change of scope number 1, but the contract requirements were poorly drafted, contract management or administration failure, and cash flow and payment issues. So the change in scope, again, you need to make sure that you have a robust design, what is required, the contract clearly sets out the obligations on the parties, there's no gray areas, and again, that should hopefully help you reduce the change in scope. The other thing I think with the change in scope, and one of the issues that I see happening in the region, is the amount of time that is dedicated to the design phase, to the conceptual studies phase as well. More time that's done in the front end planning, the less chances are that you're going to end up in a change in scope situation. Contract requirements being poorly drafted. Again, I think there's a lot to this subject, and we could speak to hours about this, but again, it's making sure that the contract is being put together and is being read from start to finish. One of the common issues that I see that happens a lot is the legal department will draft the terms and conditions. The cost engineers will do the cost side. Maybe project controls or a scheduler will do the program side. The engineers will do the scope of work. Health and safety will do with it. Quality will do that bit. You end up with a document with many different sections. But what a lot of organizations don't do is then, once that document is assembled, go through it very clearly and make sure all the sections work together and all the mechanisms work together. Another thing that you can do here is that you could actually as well use a more standard form of contract, which has been tried and tested and has been put together by many experts around the world. That is another way, and it's got a bit more certainty with it. Contract management and administration failure. I touched on this before. I do think that, you know, as a project team, there is a lot of worth in, at the start of the project, spending time as a team, making sure you understand the contract, and most importantly, understand the mechanisms and how they work, and how certain issues, when certain issues come up, how they can be addressed. Again, in my opinion, one of the ways to do this, and what we've done with different organizations, and it can be on the operator's side of the table, it can be on the contractor's side of the table, is do wargaming at the start. So we would come in, set out certain scenarios with the team. They would go away, have a look at what they think, how the contract would work, come back, discuss it. And at least you're testing the team on certain scenarios coming up, and they understand how the mechanism works and understand how the contract works. It's really surprising how little this is done, and how you know, even just spending, doesn't need to be even a week, you know, as a team, a couple of days doing that, how it can make a big difference when you're executing the project. The last one is cash flow and payment issues. This is an issue, and I think given the circumstances that's going on with COVID at the moment and the low oil price, this can be an even bigger issue. When you're looking at how to address this, I think you know, from the operator's side of the table, you need to be careful who you procure. You need to make sure that you know, the parties that you're entering into contract with are financially sound. That is a much more challenging call to make these days, given the current circumstances, but I think it's important. The other thing that I think you need to do is address the first one, and that is change in scope. And it even ties into the third. So if, for example, you don't deal with change in scope swiftly, you don't deal with variations swiftly, you've got you know, poor contract management and administration failure, that will lead to a cash flow issue on the project for sure. If you don't deal with issues when they come up, that's going to cause a problem. And we see it time and time again, but most contracts are written to deal with changes or variations as they happen in a prospective manner, not leaving it all to the end and looking back at a retrospective manner. Moving on, if I break it down a stage further, so now what I've done is I've actually broken the data down into certain countries. And the reason I wanted to show you this is, if, for example, say you're a contractor or, you know, an operator looking to enter the market in Iraq, there's certain causations that we see in Iraq, but then if you're going to the UAE, it's different. So again, you can use the data, and because it's, you know, broken down in a way that you can isolate it to countries and types of projects, it will give you a reasonable idea of what to expect on your projects when you enter into them in the oil and gas market in these countries. So, you know, for example, if we look at Iraq, we've got change in scope, tender errors or inaccurate estimates, and cash flow and payment issues, and design if information was issued late. So I've talked to you about change in scope, but for example, tender errors or inaccurate estimates. This again is, making sure that the tender process is managed very clearly. I think it's very important, again, that this is, a lot of time and effort is spent at this. I can tell you many times when we have issues, we have to go back into the tender document. Number one here is the contract requirements were poorly drafted. Again, I go back to a point that I talked to you about. It's really important that when you put a document together, a contract together, there's lots of different departments that put the different sections together. You need someone to have an overview and pull it all together. Okay, the last thing I want to just talk to you about the data and how you can use it, which I found very interesting, is what we did is we looked at the last time there was a major drop in the oil price, which roughly speaking was from July 2014 through to July 2016, which I'm sure everyone remembers. And what we did was we looked at the oil and gas projects that had works ongoing in this period, which was 34 projects, and looked at the projects that were outside this period, which was 14 projects. And then what we did was we said, okay, when the oil price drops like that, how were these projects, what were the types of causations that came out of that period? So what we're trying to do is use the data to say, okay, in a low oil price period, when it drops, how does that affect the causation of this disputes? And you can see up on the screen here, the sort of 4 things that came up. Number 1 was change in scope. 2 was approvals were late and design information was issued late. And then the last one is contract requirements were poorly drafted. So on the face of it, you might say, okay, some of these we've seen before, but it's the reasoning behind it. The reason change in scope was high was because when the oil price dropped, and again, I'm talking to you about my own experience and what we saw, was often the operators would revisit what was going on the project and say, now in a low oil price, do we still need everything we need? Okay. And there was variations issued to reduce scope, change specs, etc. Approvals being late, the reason that is high up there and comes into this is, again, there was a hold on if they were looking at design or if things were being passed from the contractor for approval, it was reviewed because, again, in a lower oil price, do they still need the same requirements under the contract? Do they still need the same scope of work? The same with design information. This ties into the same kind of pattern again. The low oil price meant they had to revisit things going on the project and just check we still need everything we need in the new sort of lower oil price environment, and that caused delays with the design information being issued. The last one is a really interesting one, and I think what happened before the last oil, the drop in oil between 2014 and 2016, the oil price was very high. I think a lot of commercial agreements were made in the industry, which didn't really test the contract terms and conditions. And I think when the oil price dropped, there was more resistance from the parties to do those commercial deals. And that meant that the various mechanisms that are drafted under the contract were tested. And that's why you see this one coming up. So that's really all I had to talk to you about today. I haven't seen any questions come up so far, but what I would encourage is if anybody wants to come and visit the booth and discuss this further, please do. I'll put up on the screen here as well. You can download the Crux report from our websites here and visit the dashboard we've set up as well. So if you are interested, I would encourage that. And also feel free to reach out to myself in the Abu Dhabi office. I'm happy to discuss any of this data further with you. And as I say, I think the real way to use this data is to take it and understand the kind of issues that can come up, the kind of causations of claims and disputes that can come up on your project. And then you can identify these risks and then manage those risks accordingly and hopefully avoid entering into any disputes. So thank you very much for your time today. I think that's us there. And if you have any questions or queries, please give me a shout.